All right, Alex, floor is yours.
Is it? I'm just waiting for the deck to start. Okay, amazing. Carmelo, you can see this, right?
Yes.
Alrighty. So thanks everybody. As I was mentioning, this is a webinar just targeted at pretty much newer landlords. It's pretty much like a newbie landlord. Maybe you can even call it like a master class in 30 minutes. I'm just going to be talking a little bit about everything. As a real estate investor, as a real estate agent, I frequently work with people that help them find tenants, and I've also, obviously done this for myself as well. So I'm just going to be sharing my experiences and answering some questions at the end. So, don't take anything in this webinar as legal advice. I'm not a lawyer or a paralegal. I'm just going to be basically just sharing what I have experienced. So it's just for educational purposes, and my views don't represent the views of my brokerage or Carmelo or Treb or anything else. A little bit about myself. So my name is Alex Waniecki. I'm a Toronto realtor with Remax Condos Plus. I've been a real estate investor since 2013, and there's a QR code there. If anybody wants to scan that, that will take you to all my links. And also Carmelo did share I think he pinned at the top of the message board both of our Instagrams, and there is a link there. So like I mentioned, I will be answering questions at the end, but if anybody also wants to just book a call and talk about something, there's a link there to book a call as well. So happy to take the time for that. So like I mentioned, this is for newer landlords. This is who's going to benefit from this webinar. So basically anybody who is new, who's thinking about potentially maybe purchasing and self-managing their property, or thinking about purchasing a property and having somebody manage it for them, like a property management company or a real estate agent, or landlords. This is primarily for landlords in Ontario as well. Like some of the information is transferable, but I don't really know about, like tenant landlord things from the US, for example. So primarily this is focused to those people that live in Ontario. So this is some of the topics that I'm going to be covering. Finding and screening tenants, which I guess is the most important. You want to make sure that you're finding good caliber tenants for yourself. Sometimes it can take a little bit longer to do that, but in our province, which unfortunately the laws are more tenant friendly than landlord friendly, it's incredibly important. I'm sure you've seen things in the news. Now, I don't want to like scare people. The news is there just to get attention. They don't report on things like 99.9% of all, tenants paid their rent on time this month. They just report on the 0.01% just to get eyes and people watching. It's become kind of ridiculous, like clickbait, basically. So I'm going to talk a little bit about managing the property and the day-to-day expectations. So one thing that I like to say is today's favor becomes tomorrow's duty. It's something I'll emphasize on a little bit later in this presentation. I'm going to talk about knowing your rights, and most importantly, it's not like memorizing your rights, but knowing where to research your rights and obligations, because laws do change. So just having the right access to people is really important for this. I'm going to talk about some common processes like rent increases and tenants moving out, and also I'm just going to also talk a bit about making sure that you work with qualified third-party professionals and experts, both as your contractors and also just like as your partners, whether it's provide legal advice or help you select the right property, and so forth. So how to find tenants. There's lots of different services out there. You can definitely do it yourself. And when I started being a landlord in 2013, I wasn't a real estate agent, so I was very much just relying on things like Kijiji and Facebook to find tenants. It did involve me having to like drive to the property, do showings, follow up with people, chase people. Sometimes it was also difficult to find out who's qualified or not. That's one way that you can go. You can, if it's a condo, you maybe can even like really find a tenant just by putting a sign in the lobby. Sometimes, especially in some specific buildings, I do see a high turnover of people that stay in the building. I don't know if turnover is the right word, but basically when somebody's moving, they're looking to maybe for a larger unit in the same building, or they know somebody that wants to move into the building. That's usually just a general good sign that the building is also well managed and maintained. You may also hire a real estate agent to do this. So as realtors, we pretty much have a flat fee for doing this. It's 1 month rent plus HST, which is split between the realtor that lists the property and the realtor that brings the selected tenant. And when you hire a realtor, you do get to list your rental on the MLS. So people see it on websites like condos.ca, realtor.ca. And it is a good way to go, because if you can afford it, because you get the tenant potentially pre-screened by two parties. So first of all, their agent that decides to work with them does pre-screen them to make sure it's not going to be a waste of their time for them to represent them. And then also you get your own realtor that would pre-screen the application as well. You know, when you're selecting tenants, I always kind of treat it as an interview, but it's more like of a two-way interview. It's not just are they the right fit for you, but are you the right fit for them? So like you want to kind of communicate your expectations up front and just watch out for any red flags. And when I say red flags, I mean things like maybe inconsistencies. Maybe they message you through Facebook and they tell you that they don't have a dog, but then you see that their profile picture is them and their dog. Just kind of like things like this, just like things that don't make sense and don't, because if, they're hiding things from you or not being completely honest, that's a major red flag for me. And I have seen a lot of, unfortunately, bad stories with things like even just like fake fraudulent documents floating around, fake employment letters, fake credit reports being submitted. Sometimes they're submitted like I've received reports from like I've received employment letters from like the same employer for different tenants, and I just like know off the bat that this company doesn't even exist. So, one of the benefits of working for realtors, they can kind of also help you with identifying things like this. So some questions to ask. This is usually what I get through, like when somebody, I would just jump maybe on a call with them before even doing a showing, like before you drive out to the property and spend your time. You want to maybe find out what do they do for work, how many people are looking to live in the home, what is the relationship of the people, like are they roommates, are they a couple, is it siblings, do they have any pets, especially for condos. Some condos have a prohibition on pets, so you can't have pets altogether, but every condo has some sort of pet rules. So you want to make sure that it aligns with the tenant and you're communicating those rules to the tenant ahead of time. You want to find out what their move-in date is, and you also kind of want to have an idea of what their credit score is. So, usually I know that not everybody is comfortable asking all these questions, especially maybe asking them about their credit score. So the way that I usually do it is I would just maybe tell them like, we're looking for tenants to have a credit score that's above whatever, 725. Is this going to be a fit for you? So instead of asking, you're just stating your expectation, and generally people will tell you. But when you're looking at people's credit report, it's honestly not even about the credit score. I mean, the credit score is, I think, just like a good indication of how much the bank likes them, but it doesn't mean that they're not carrying a bunch of debt. So you want to look at the whole report. For my clients, I even just do my own credit report on tenants through my brokerage to make sure that we're getting documents that haven't been modified. And just like, does everything make sense? Does their income, does their kind of like what they do for work, does everything line up for them to want to rent your property? Is there something that just seems to be off about it? Because that can be doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to move in and stop paying rent, but it might be an indication that they're going to move in, and then after 2 months, they're going to realize that, it's not a good fit for them. And then they're going to be looking to break their lease early. And unfortunately, as a landlord, if somebody breaks their lease early, like, yeah, there are, they're supposed to be there for the full year and so forth. But are you going to really take somebody to court for like 2 months rent? Or for like, what damages are you actually incurring? Like, damages would be between then and then when you find the new tenants. Like, it just doesn't make sense. So you just want to kind of make sure everything lines up and that you believe that these are people that would be able to stay there for at least a year, but maybe even more. And everything kind of lines up and doesn't come off as weird or why is this happening? So these are the documents that I request. So we do have a standard rental application. If you want to get a copy of it, let me know. It does say in the bottom of that application when tenants sign it that they give you the right to do a credit check, to contact their employer. So that does cover you for that. So yeah, if you want that, let me know. Happy to send that to you. I always also ask for an employment letter and 2 pay stubs, government ID, their full credit report, and I ask for this from all tenants that are going to reside in the home that are of age. Now, there are some exceptions, like mom and dad, and they're in their 50s, and the kids are like 20 and university students. Maybe I don't really need their credit report, but if everybody's kind of like of age and working, I would want to see their credit report. And another thing that I want to talk about here, like really brief, because I did put rental application, and there are ways for people to, they put their references on there, they put their manager on there, they put whatever on there. I never actually call whoever's listed on that rental application. I always go through back channels to verify their employment, because I honestly, I don't really know who I'm talking to. So, I always kind of just do my own due diligence and navigate a different way. Like sometimes I've got even as far as calling the headquarters of a company that's located in another country, asking them for their human resources number in their Toronto location, calling the Toronto location, and kind of just going around in circles like this. Because before I got into real estate, I was in a different industry, but I heavily emphasized on recruitment and selection. So that's where I've developed a lot of these kind of strategies that I've used. Like I just treat it like the way I would do pre-screening for an employee. So how do I do a background check, or how I do a background check? So I guess I already kind of started talking a little bit about this. I don't just focus on the tenant. I focus on like who else they're putting on there. I do a background check on the person, just like dead giveaway sometimes. Like if they put a human resources person and you look them up online and the human resources person doesn't have a LinkedIn profile, that's kind of strange. If you look up their company online and you go on the company's LinkedIn and they have like 5 employees on there, that's really strange too. So these are all kind of things that should come out at you. I don't normally focus on the provided references. I do Google searches, Instagram searches, Facebook, LinkedIn searches. There's also some other websites that I check that I've saved until the end of this presentation I'm going to talk about. And just again, like the reoccurring theme in this presentation is, does everything make sense? Does everything line up correctly? If the tenant wants to use a guarantor, this is sometimes acceptable. I would always pre-screen the guarantor as a tenant, so I would always request the same documents from the guarantor as from the tenant. And the guarantor is only there for the duration of the lease. So if you sign a 1-year lease, the guarantor is there for the 1 year. After the 1 year is up, the guarantor is no longer responsible for anything there. And when I look at the guarantor, I believe that they should be a strong guarantor. So somebody who has a sufficient income where they can pay their own bills, and potentially if the tenant is not able to pay their bills, cover those bills as well. And really, for my clients, I only recommend a tenant with a guarantor if it's like a university student and the guarantor is their parents. I don't recommend an adult who has a guarantor who's like another friend. They're like, this person, like, good luck chasing them around to get anything out of them. So just best practice for that is just like, if it's a university student, it's okay, but friends, all of that, I would just kind of stay away from that. And the practice that I've used before is I just would add the guarantor as a tenant on the lease. And that, I don't know if that would stand up in the landlord tenant board. Luckily, knock on wood, I haven't had to have my clients test that. But yeah, again, I'm always very careful about treading around guarantors. And just again, if it's a parent, it's fine. But these guarantor friends and all that stuff, they're friends today, they're not friends tomorrow, and the guarantor doesn't answer the phone. So what are you going to do? Sue everybody? Just again, doesn't make sense. One of the things about Ontario's not very landlord friendly. So you have to make sure the tenant rights. We do have a lot of good resources online that you can access the Residential Tenancies Act online. You can get standard tenant documents like the Form N9 and 11, rent increase, all of this. I would use the landlord tenant board documents for everything. So if somebody's looking to end the lease, if the tenant's telling you they're going to move out in 60 days, I would ask them to sign an N9, which is a landlord tenant board document, and send that over to me. That's enforceable in the landlord tenant board. If for some reason they don't move out you can use that to file for an eviction. I would also recommend that you have a good legal expert in the field. Generally, lawyers don't really engage in landlord-tenant matters, and they're quite expensive. So a good paralegal, I think, would go a long way. Just somebody that you can bounce ideas of, build a relationship with them. I don't think like they should charge you to answer a question on the phone, but just again, like you try to find resources like that. It's always good to have a paralegal, especially if things do go sideways. It's somebody you can engage quickly and they can take action. And just be mindful that the laws do change. So it's you have to continue to grow in this business. So constantly keep educating yourself and getting more up to date with what's happening in landlord-tenant matters. You maybe want to join like a landlord-tenant Facebook group where landlords share common matters that happen to them. You can even post questions anonymously. I do this a lot, and it kind of helps me to sometimes reassure things that I'm dealing with. But always, if it's something like quite serious, I would always give my paralegal a call to have a conversation about what to recommend my client. Ontario standard lease. So there is a standard for this now that you have to use. You can get a copy of it either from me, I'm happy to send it to you, or you can get it online from the landlord-tenant website. I think it's called the Form 410, if I remember correctly. So it outlines the landlord's responsibility. It sets out the terms of the tenancy, who pays what utilities. There are maybe additional terms you want to put in there. I always have them in a schedule. Like if they're renting a house from you and it has a yard, who's responsible for cutting the grass, who's responsible for snow removal, all of these things. Now, do keep in mind, as much as maybe you put in your lease with them that they're responsible for snow removal or cutting the grass, as far as the municipality is concerned, if your grass is not cut, you're getting the ticket. So make sure you're having that conversation with them up front, and you're also kind of monitoring this. I always kind of put some minor repairs and minor items on the tenant. So things like changing light bulbs, unclogging the sink, things like this. I put it on the tenant and kind of make sure that they understand that I'm not going to be, driving out there to change a light bulb. Key deposit. So outline how many keys they get. The key deposit should also be reasonable. It should be enough to cover the cost of replacing keys if they're not returned, but it shouldn't be anything ridiculous. And you can only use the key deposit as a key deposit. So you can't use the key deposit as a damage deposit. Damage deposits are not permitted in Ontario. It can only be a key deposit. And any special rules like parking or anything like that should be outlined either in the lease or in an additional schedule attached to the lease. I do get sometimes landlords that ask for post-dated checks. It's not really recommended. Like, I don't really see the purpose of this. I know that sometimes landlords want to be like in the power of like knowing that, okay, I have the check, I can go deposit it in the morning, I don't have to chase the tenant around. But post-dated checks, you're not permitted to ask for them. A tenant can agree to it, and then after they get the keys, they can say, oh, I'm not giving you post-dated checks. I'm going to pay through e-transfer. So, e-transfer is the way to go. There's also pre-authorized payment forms that I see being used sometimes. I don't know what the software is called, but I've seen this a few times where it just goes right from the bank account. So maybe that's something you want to consider. But I usually just like put in my lease that the tenant will pay rent on the first of the month before 12 p.m. Toronto time. And that way, everybody's kind of on the same page. What is the expectations above that? I also do sometimes see landlords asking for additional months of rent up front. Again, asking for anything above the Residential Tenancies Act first and last month up front is not a legal request. And I would not even really consider this. So, sometimes I get like multiple tenants that want to lease out my client's property. And if they're all good and they're kind of competing for the property and somebody wants to offer a few months of rent up front, it may sway the client to go with them. But I would never take like a year of rent up front as a substitute for somebody's credibility, because they're there today, they're gone, they're going to be there after a year, they're still going to be your problem. And if they actually prepay the rent, they can go through the landlord tenant board and ask for you to return that prepaid rent to them as well. So be careful for that. It should never be a substitute for somebody's ability to be a tenant, ability to pay. Essentially, you shouldn't just consider somebody based on their willingness to throw a year of rent up front. And like I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, damage deposits are also not legal. So annual rent increases and rent control. So I'm going to talk about this real brief. So rent control in Ontario. So any property that was first occupied for residential purposes before November 15th of 2018, rent control applies. So the provincial government sets out what the maximum amount that a landlord can increase rent for that year is. I think like the last 4 years in a row, except for COVID, when it was 0 1 year, it's always been 2.5%, which is supposed to be aligned with the rate of inflation. But any unit that was first occupied for residential purposes after November 15th of 2018, there is no rent control. Now, I do expect that they're probably going to bring rent control back, but for now, it's not there. So realistically, like after a year, you can increase rent as much as you want. Most would just like increase it to market. And if you compare like 2022 to 2025, for example, 2022 had a higher market rents than 2025 did. So in some cases, it hasn't really benefited people, but it did for those who maybe moved into the place in 2020 and got a surprise in 2021 or 2022 when rents were crazy high because of the pandemic, kind of near the tail end. So excuse me, you do need to give 60 days notice to increase rent. So, sorry, 90 days notice to increase rent, and it should be before the rent payment date. So, for example, if Carmelo pays rent on the 1st of the month and 1 year is going to be January 1st of 2026, I have to give him notice. I have to give him notice before September 1st. If I give him notice on September 2nd, his rent increase is now actually going to be as of February 1st. So just make sure that you kind of, have these timelines earmarked. There is a form for rent increase, and that's an N1 form. Again, you can get that on the Landlord Tenant Board website. They make it really easy for you. There's like a form for everything. And, I always recommend that you inspect the unit with your tenant. You document any deficiencies, take pictures. You show them emergency shutoffs, like where to shut off the water to the unit, show that everything is working correctly, have them confirm and sign this, or just take pictures and send an email to everybody and say, like, this is, everything was found to be fine. Here's a few pictures of scuffs we found on the walls that were already there. Make sure you get their tenant insurance ahead of time. I recommend an absolute minimum of $1 million liability, but really we should change this to 2. And key deposit should be provided before the tenancy. Confirmation that utilities have been transferred should be provided before the tenancy. All of that information ahead of time. So the Landlord Tenant Board website does have some really good forms for you to use. Like I mentioned before, forms to end tenancy, both by the landlord and by the tenant, mutual agreements to do that. So, use that as a resource, because if you do your own forms or like emails or text messages or things like that, that's not enforceable under the Residential Tenancies Act. So it's only enforceable if you use their forms. If you need help with any of this, again, Carmelo and I, but mostly me in this aspect, are a resource to you. So, book a call, send a message on Instagram or through Meetup. Happy to answer any questions you might have. And finally, some other resources that I use to pre-screen tenants that I want to talk about. So OpenRoom and Canly are quite similar. Well, actually, no. Canly is a website where you can basically find out, like, I think it's small claims court cases. So you can just put people's names and you can see, kind of history as far as any legal matters are concerned. OpenRoom contains cases that are around residential tenancy matters. And then Single Key is actually an insurance company that charges you between 5 and 10% of the monthly rent. I think it's actually 6%. I'm not sure, but I think it actually varies from time to time. So as long as the tenant qualifies based on their system, this insurance does cover you as a landlord in the event that they stop paying rent, cause damage to the unit, break their lease early. So that is a really good resource. Now, if you want to qualify for Single Key, you do have to get your tenant through a realtor. But I think that this is a great service that alleviates some people's worries based on what's in the news. So some final tips. Maintain a good relationship with your tenants. I believe that ultimately they are your client, so treat them well and with respect. Really give them space as well. Like, don't, I've heard of like landlords like constantly reaching out and just like, they don't need like a parent here. That's not your duty. Really pick your battles. There might be small things that are not worth getting into a whole situation over. Remember that today's favor is tomorrow's duty. So if you do something for somebody once, it's no longer a favor, it's now an expectation. Benchmark and document. So I recommend by minimum having everything documented by email, not text messages, not verbal. If you have a verbal conversation with your tenants, send them an email after, and then save that email for yourself about what is it that you guys talked about. You are required to inspect your unit regularly as per your landlord-tenant insurance, which you should get. You need to switch your insurance from occupier insurance to landlord insurance. And usually the insurance policy requires you to check the property every 6 months. So maybe you want to go by there, take a few pictures, send yourself an email. That way it's kind of benchmarked that you inspected the property. And make sure that you do your rent increases. Even if you're worried that if you increase the rent by 2.5%, the tenant's going to be upset or maybe move out or whatever, because it does build up. You don't know how long this person's going to be there. And you want to be able to, your expenses are going to continue to go up with inflation. You want to be able to stay on top of that. So make sure that you are doing what you are legally permitted to do as a landlord. So, oh my God, that was a lot of talking. Carmelo, maybe we can stop the recording and I can answer any questions.